Hey, I'm Tony P, back again with another video. This one's going to be about over-the-top dust extraction on the table saw. I like to call it OTT for short. And this will be a follow-up to the table saw setup video I recently uploaded. If you've not seen that one, I will link it up here and also down in the description. Definitely check it out. In that video, I go over all the different features of my table saw setup, including the over-the-top dust extraction. I just didn't get into a whole lot of detail about this feature in that video because I knew that was going to be a long video, and I wanted to make this one so I could really explain the concept, because I think this is one of the coolest things I think I've ever made. So no matter what kind of dust collection you have under the table saw, there's still going to be a small percentage of dust that comes off the blade, and that dust comes directly into your face. And there's really just a few different things you can do about this. The most common thing is to do nothing. And anytime I'm operating the table saw and I do nothing, it takes about 10 or 15 minutes, and I start to get this nasty feeling in the back of my throat because I'm inhaling dust, and it's usually pre-finished plywood. So it's not just the wood, it's also glue and whatever that finish is. So it's a toxic mix that can't be good for my health. If I'm using someone else's table saw, I'll wear a mask. I usually wear an N95. I like the kind with the blow flap, and I prefer the kind that have ear straps, but sometimes I can't find that kind, and the only kind I can find is the kind that are head straps, which are top and bottom straps. But it's pretty easy to modify that kind by just cutting them in the middle and retying them so they're ear straps. The advantage to the ear strap style is that you could remove one of the straps and just let it hang from the other ear. That way, if I have to talk to someone or I'm doing a task that doesn't involve dust, it's a lot more convenient to just partially remove it from my face than have to completely remove the mask. But I still would prefer not to wear a mask, which is probably why most people don't. The last option is to extract that dust, and as far as what you can buy, there are blade guards that have dust ports. Personally, I'm not a fan of blade guards, but that is one option. Actually, I don't see how anybody gets anything done with a blade guard on their table saw, but you know, it is out there. And then the other thing is over-arm dust extraction, which OTT is most similar to. The biggest difference between the two is that the arm involved in over-arm dust extraction hangs out over the right side of the table saw. It's structural because it's what's holding the extraction head up, and it's typically made out of metal tubing, which is probably why they're so expensive. And if you did desire to move the arm away from the table saw, it's going to be a bit difficult to do that. The other option is to build something yourself, which is what the OTT is. And the difference between the OTT and most of the other designs that I've seen is that it's very simple, it's very effective, and it's something that could be built in a single day, if not a half a day. So now I'm going to show you some clips where I put a bunch of lights around the table saw so you can really see how much blade dust is coming off of my blade. And I use thin kerf blades, so if you're using a regular 10-inch blade with a thicker kerf, you're probably going to get about twice as much blade dust. And then I'll show a clip with the OTT in action. So let's get into some over-the-top dust extraction. So there's going to be 4 main components that you have to build, 5 if you include the shelf for the vacuum cleaner. I've got some modifications I'm going to be making back there, which I'll get into in a minute, but everything else is going to be stuff you'll have to buy unless you've already got it on hand. So we've got hoses, fittings, a little bit of piping, and then a small shop vac. Unless your table saw is hooked up to a conventional dust collector, in that case, hopefully you can just tap into that. So we've got the head, then there's the main shaft or tube. I call it a tube because it's hollow. Then there's the sleeve, and then the sealing mount. The dust comes off the blade, it goes through the nozzle, it goes through this short section of hose, then it goes through the tube, it comes out the top of the tube and goes over to the vacuum cleaner. Right now I've got it set up with a Cyclone dust separator and this huge box on the floor, but I plan on eliminating that from the setup for a couple of different reasons. The main one is that there's not enough blade dust coming off my blade to justify having the Cyclone. And the other thing is that Cyclone is the least efficient Cyclone that I have. I made a video about Cyclone separators. If you haven't seen it, I think it was a great video. It's one of my most entertaining videos. It did have some information in it, but it was like heavy on the entertainment. But all my separators are Chinese Cyclone separators, and this one's called an SN50 Generation 1. It's the least efficient of all of them because it has a flat ceiling. So what happens is the dust goes in there and just kind of swirls around until the vacuum shuts down, and then it falls. So it works better on an intermittent tool like a miter saw, where after you make the cut, the saw shuts down and the vacuum stops, and then the dust falls. But on the table saw, you know, I leave the saw running. So it's like I'll make a cut, then that dust is swirling around in there, and then I'll make another cut and more dust comes in there. And a lot of that dust ends up getting by the separator. So I'm going to eliminate all of the Generation 1s from my shop at some point. But also this is just something I can't really justify because there's just not enough dust. Now, maybe if I was in a high production shop and I was making 2 gallons of blade dust every week, then it would make sense. But even then, having this huge box it's too big. So maybe a 3-gallon box just right underneath the vacuum cleaner rather than sitting on the floor. But I'm just going to go straight to the vacuum because if that vacuum was completely full of dust, it would probably only weigh a few extra pounds, and it's just going to make more sense. Another thing I'm going to do is eliminate this section of pipe. This is made out of 3 rigid extension wands off of a rigid shop vac, and those are like $12 a piece. So that's an expensive section of pipe that I could use, you know, elsewhere. So I'm going to replace that with a piece of 2-inch PVC and eliminate the Cyclone in the box entirely. The last change I'm going to make is I'm going to swap the shelf that the vacuum is sitting on. I'm going to swap that out with one of my hanging vacuum setups like I have on my other vacuums. Those make it a lot more convenient to clean the filter. When I do swap it out, I'll make a video about why I like to hang them high, because those are pretty cool. The last thing I wanted to mention is that I've got 2 vacuums set up on the same AutoVac switch, that one and the one under the table. I've got a 3-way plug plugged into the switch, and then both of the vacuums are plugged into that. If you're not familiar with an AutoVac switch, you plug your tool into one side and you plug your vacuum into the other. And when you turn the tool on, the vacuum comes on automatically. When you turn the tool off, the vacuum shuts down automatically, but it does it a few seconds after the tool, and that helps clear out the hoses. So adding one of these to a tool you want to collect dust from makes the dust collection effortless. And I'll put links to several different AutoVac switches down in the description. So now let's take a closer look at all the parts. The head has about 5 inches of travel. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that. And then also with the nozzle off, that's going to give you an extra 3 inches. So altogether we've got about 8 inches of travel with just moving the head up and removing the nozzle. And that is enough to drop my corner cutter in here, which is a jig that I use quite a bit. And then I also have some more travel up at the top, but there's 8 inches there. The sides are made out of 1/2-inch plywood. It's actually 1/2-inch import, so it's a little less than a real 1/2-inch. And then these 2 sections are made out of 1/4-inch import plywood, so it's a little less than a 1/4-inch. And then this section down here is 3/4-inch import. So it's basically 18 millimeter. I think that's 10 millimeter. It's either 10 or 12, I can't remember. And then this is 5 millimeter. Mainly it's to keep it less bulky. I wanted to make the head as thin and streamlined as possible. And then there's 2 holes that are drilled in the bottom section because this side is accepting the small hose, and then the back side is what the nozzle goes onto. This way allows you to connect each one of these independently without having any kind of fasteners or anything. There's really no fasteners at all on this whole thing. It's all just a tight friction fit, and that was by design. You could put thumb screws on this travel if you wanted to, but I wanted to make it so that there weren't going to be any fasteners, so there's no hardware. The whole idea here is that, you know, if you need to, you can push it up out of the way and get that Here comes Kumba. You can get it out of the way to do whatever you have to do if you have, some cuts to make where you didn't want this in the way. The nozzle is also a friction fit. It connects on here just tight enough to stay in place while in use, but it's loose enough that if I had a bad kickback and the workpiece lifted off the table and hit the nozzle, it's most likely going to come off of there. And I feel like that's safer than if it was locked to the head. In that case, the whole thing might get involved. So it's basically a sacrificial part that if something happened to it, I could just replace it. And so far, I haven't had to replace it. I've had this hooked up on my saw for over 5 years. And originally when I started running it, I would run the nozzle over the blade. And there is a bit of drift. Sometimes if you knock into this thing, it can drift a little bit. And I've had some issues where the blade hit the nozzle. And I stopped running it that way because the dust collection still works fine as long as I'm a little bit over the blade, all the way up to about 1.5 inches over the blade. Now, the closer I am to the blade, the better it works, but it still works great. So I just run it a little over the blade and it works perfect. Now, this is in no way a blade guard. This is just a dust shroud. It doesn't get in the way until the fence gets over to the 3/4 inch or less range. The fence hits the nozzle right about 3/4 inch, but I'm still able to make those rips all the way up to 1/4 inch without removing the nozzle, as long as I use my thin rip pushy stick. The big hole that holds the nozzle doesn't go all the way through, and then the small hole is where the hose hooks up, and it does go all the way through. Here's another look at the head. I was wrong about the lower section being made out of 3/4 inch plywood. It's actually made out of 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood, and each piece has its own hole drilled in it. The lower piece has a 2.5 inch hole, and that's what accepts the nozzle. I did put a little bit of tape around it so that it's a tighter fit. And then the other piece has a smaller hole that corresponds with whatever hose you're working with. In my case, that was an 1 3/8 hole. That hole does need to be smaller. That way it's got this backing so that when you connect the nozzle in there, it'll bottom out and it'll reference back to the exact same place, centered over top of the blade. The next section is the tube, which is basically 4 inches by 2 1/8. And there's 2 holes. There's a hole at the bottom, and then there's another hole up at the top. The tube is made out of pre-finished plywood, and I turned the plywood slick side to the inside, thinking that that would help the dust go through the tube. It works flawlessly. The sleeve is also a friction fit. There's about 8 inches of travel until the hose hits the top of the notch. It's really not necessary to make a notch. I could have just made a slot. So the hole that comes down, it doesn't necessarily need to go all the way to the very bottom. I could have just made a notch for, roughly, 10 to 12 inches of travel. If I want to, I can remove the hose, and then I have another 5 inches of travel here. So I can move the sleeve up all the way up to the top there. And then if I want, I could take the hose out and continue to go up another 5 inches, which overall is going to give me around 20 inches of clearance over the blade. The sleeve is connected to the ceiling mount with a bolt, and there's a little bit of travel left and right. This allows me to align the nozzle to the blade rather than having to align the table saw station to the nozzle. The last part is the ceiling mount, which is basically just a piece of plywood with a couple of pieces on the sides for extra support. And it's just wide enough to catch 2 ceiling trusses. And the sleeve, because it's bolted to the ceiling mount, it needs to be bolted together before it's mounted. So, pretty simple, but very effective. The nozzle. This is a 2.5 inch rigid attachment. It's called a 14 inch wet nozzle. It originally comes with 2 rubber strips, so it's basically like a big squeegee. This is about $16 at the Home Depot. It's perfect for the over-the-top dust extraction because it's very narrow, and it being 14 inches completely covers the blade. The only thing that would make this better is if it was clear, and at first I was really not sure about this because of the fact that I couldn't see the blade. But this is really meant for sheet goods. Not that it won't work for general woodworking, it's really meant for sheet goods. So if you're skeptical about using something you can't see the blade, then, don't do it. If you are interested in getting one of these, I'll put a link in the description. And I'll also put a link for one that's on Amazon. It's a different brand. It's called a Workshop. It looks identical. It's supposed to be compatible. The ones they make now are a little bit different than this one. All of the rigid stuff has switched over to locking attachments. So there's going to be little ribs. And it's most likely that you're going to have to shave some of those ribs off in order for that thing to fit into the 2.5-inch hole and bottom out the way it needs to. Not really a difficult task, but I think it needs to be modified. Otherwise, I'll put a link for the Home Depot one along with the Amazon one down in the description. The one from Amazon is usually about 20 bucks, so it's definitely going to be cheaper to just go to Home Depot if you live near a Home Depot. But awesome thing, really easy to do. The only modification that I've made is I have added a small piece of a paintbrush in the back, and I've taped that in with some zip tape. If you don't have any zip tape, I highly recommend getting a roll of zip tape. This is a $35 roll. It's about 90 feet, and this will last me maybe a year or two. I use it for all sorts of different things around the shop, around the house, and it's one of my favorite tapes. I taped this in here almost 6 years ago, and it's still in there. And the paintbrush just kind of helps a little bit with the dust collection. If you have any comments or questions, definitely leave them down there in the comments section. If you think you'd be interested in watching a build video, like a tutorial, I have been considering building one of these, even though I don't need another one, but I thought I would build another one just to make like a tutorial. And I may actually make some plans as well. So if either one of those things sounds interesting, definitely let me know down in the comments. And until next time.
Yeah, you know me. You down with OTT? Yeah, you know me. You down with OTT?